John Greiner, and this is my wife, Jen. We've been married since 2009 and have both attended Faith Church since 2005. We joined in 2007, and we have been part of many different ministries here at Faith.
I graduated from Purdue in 2009 and started working as a nurse in the ICU at that time. I have been at IU Health Arnett since 2010.
And I've been working as a police officer since 2009 when I graduated Purdue, and we have 3 great children who God has blessed us with.
2020 has been anything but normal for our family. As an ICU nurse, you get used to working in stressful situations, but with the outbreak of COVID-19, it has brought a certain unknown to the world of healthcare that has been unlike anything I've ever seen as a bedside nurse. In the past, I have never really worried about bringing a disease or a virus home to my kids and family, but with COVID, this is not the case. Especially in the beginning, I struggled with the thought of contracting the virus and bringing it home to my 3 small children and not even knowing it. It became very evident that I would have some inner battles to face that I've never faced before in my career.
2020 has also been a challenging year for me as well. Constant news of bad police interactions, having to continue to work during the midst of a pandemic and serve my community, and general fear of how friends and family were going to perceive me and my line of profession at times seemed to be overwhelming.
During the past few months, the stresses and work seemed to be overflowing into my home life. I was beginning to see myself have less patience with my children, and my mind was so scattered it was hard for me to connect with John. I was blaming it on the kids misbehaving and needing more discipline and not seeing my sinful heart at all. Luckily, God is patient, and during a dark and quiet ride to work one morning, I repented of my worry and my anxious thoughts. God is showing me the idols of my heart by wanting to be in control of the situation and knowing all the details. I wasn't trusting Him, and this was showing up in so many other areas of my life. God, in His grace, showed me where I was placing my trust and where I needed to put it. After I repented, I felt such a burden taken off my shoulders. I allowed God to be in control of areas that I was wanting control. The Psalms have been such a comfort to me during this time. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations, and I will be exalted in the earth."
One of the Bible verses that I have continually dwelled on during my profession, but especially right now, has been Micah 6:8, which says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." I know as a believer, my first and most important identity is as a child of God. I am called to act justly and to love mercy. I am called to, above all, follow what God says, not what man says. I am called to fear God and live by His statutes. Jeremiah 22 verse 3 says, "I am told to do what is just and right, rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place."
COVID is becoming the new norm. I am learning a new way to be a nurse in a setting that is allowing me to show love and compassion that wasn't normally there. Obviously, the stressors are still there. I find myself asking, have I taken all the proper precautions? Have I suited up properly and taken off all my PPE in the right way? Even if I am doing all these things right and following all the proper procedures, there is still a chance I could contract this virus. I am learning every day to meditate on ways to trust God. In Philippians, Paul says in chapter 4, verse 8, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." There are plenty of things to think about that are worthy of praise. God has protected me and my family during this time. God has given me opportunities to be bold in my faith around my coworkers and is giving me a chance to share the hope that is within me. God is allowing me to battle worry and fear with the power of the Holy Spirit to His glory. Finally, God is showing me where unconfessed sin affects many different areas of my life, and in His grace allows me to bring my heart to Him and to trust in Him.
Being the leader of a household is normally a hard job, but this year has brought many stresses and opportunities to fear. It's been challenging to work with our small kids when Jen comes home, keeping them away from her until she has a chance to get all of her work stuff put away. Our 8-month-old daughter, Lena, especially doesn't understand why mommy at times can't hold her right away. God has also brought many tough conversations up with friends and family about the world events. God has been gracious, though, in giving us strength to filter our conversation through the lens of the gospel. As long as I am making God big in my life and pointing others to him, I know that I am in safe hands. I know that the center of God's will is the safest thing for me and my family to be in, and knowing this allows us to battle our fear and not to worry about what tomorrow brings. This has brought up many blessings into our...
So that I somewhat minimize my allergies. Most of you are familiar with J.R. Tolkien's series, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The heroes of both works of literature are beings called the Hobbits. Hobbits were smaller than normal humans, unassuming, uninvolved, uninteresting to the outside world, and largely uninfluential. By all standards of Tolkien's literary world, hobbits were seemingly inconsequential folks. However, in Tolkien's works, these inconsequential, unexpected little people save the world. At the end of the series, the entire world is bowing down to these little hobbits. Tolkien's work was not a typical clash of superheroes with superhuman strength, but of how the seemingly foolish ones overcame the seemingly invincible one. With that in mind, I encourage you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. And as soon as you get there, you're going to see that we're going to be speaking about the story of David and Goliath this morning, a great story. Our summer series is called Overcoming Fear and Anxiety, and today we are speaking about the victory belongs to the Lord. If you have noticed in the last few weeks in our series, we have been featuring biblical characters who demonstrated courage in very fearful circumstances. 2 weeks ago, we spoke about Daniel in the lion's den. Last week, we spoke about Joshua. And of course, how can we not include David in this series, David and Goliath? The David and Goliath narrative provides us with a contrast between worldly courage and what we'll see as David's biblical courage. And let me start with a bit about how I am approaching this text. There are three primary human characters in the text. The first one, we know, the scary, scaly, serpent-like giant. I say all those descriptions for a reason. He's portrayed scale armor and all kinds of things. He's portrayed in a certain way. But Goliath, who taunts God's people, he is God's people's adversary. Then we have the characters of Israel and King Saul. These folks are all fearful. And then we have the giant slayer, David. When we read the text and try to wring out its application for us, most of us typically apply David's example to ourselves, and we aspire to be like David. That's not bad or that's not wrong. However, it's not fully complete either. Why don't we ever put ourselves in the fearful Israelites' shoes? Well, if we did, that means then we're not most of the time like David, and we don't typically want to acknowledge that. If we're not like David and more like the fearful Israelites, then we have to acknowledge that we need someone like David in our life to win the Lord's battle for us. And I submit to you that's a good place to be. Finally, there's one other aspect about David in the larger context in which we are not like at all. David was the Lord's anointed, spirit-filled king to be. He was the Lord's Messiah. Messiah is the Hebrew word for anointed one. In the previous chapter, 1 Samuel 16, God instructed the prophet Samuel to go to a rural country town called Bethlehem. There he was to anoint one son of Jesse to be the king of Israel in place of the rebellious King Saul. And when Samuel arrived at this man's home, Samuel immediately thought that Jesse's firstborn, strongest, tallest son was going to be the next king. Why wouldn't he be? But God said no. In fact, God said no to all of the sons of Jesse except the inconsequential youngest one, whom they had to bring in from the countryside because he was so inconsequential, they didn't even invite him to the family meeting. David, seriously? Hobbits? Who are they? Inconsequential people. God rebuked Samuel with these famous words, which you may remember. Do not look at the appearance or the outward height or his stature. God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the hearts. David, the youngest, most inconsequential son, became the Lord's anointed, spirit-filled king in waiting. In our passage today, so 1 Samuel 17, is the first scriptural look, the public look, at this 17-ish year old, inconsequential, foolish young man who would be king, foolish by the world's standards. This is our first look at him for all of us to see. Now, because this passage is significantly long, I only have time to read excerpts. It's significantly long for a reason. It's one of the longest single episode events in the Bible, and appropriately so, because this is our first look at David, the king, the would-be king. But because we have time limits this morning, I'm not going to read it all to you. So I will tell you at each step of the reading where I am, so just follow along with me. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. Okay, significant term there, Philistines. The Philistines are the constant thorn in the side of Israel. Their constant adversary, their constant tempter, like the scaly serpent Satan. David will be the king that eventually vanquishes the enemy of God's people. And he starts at a young age with their champion, Goliath. Jump down to verse 4. Then a champion. The word champion that's an English term. That is not a biblical term. In Hebrew, the biblical term is a man between. Say a man between. Say that if you will. A man between. Okay, a man between the two armies. So then a man between came out from the armies of the Philistine named Goliath from Gath. Here is the description of who he was. Whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor. He looks like a metal serpent, which weighed 5,000 shekels. His armor weighed 125 pounds. Some of us can't even lift 125 pounds, and he was wearing it. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders, and the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And to top all that off, he had a shield carrier who walked before him. Wouldn't we all love to have a shield carrier who walked before us? We'll say more about this fellow in a moment. This is by far the longest description of technology and armor in the Bible. And in the last verse that we read today is that David prevailed over this high-tech man without a sword in his hand. That's the last verse. In fact, in Israel, currently there are only 2 swords. One for the reigning King Saul, which you'll see that he tries to give David, and one for King Saul's son Jonathan. You can read about why they only had 2 swords in 1 Samuel 13 if you desire that. Jump down to verse 8. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you guys are servants of Saul? Choose a man between, like me, for yourselves, and let him come down to me." Goliath did this for 40 days. 40 days. Sounds like a period of testing, tempting in the Bible. 40 days. Verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were Here was their response, dismayed and greatly afraid. And then we get to verse 12. Maybe there's somebody who can deal with him. Maybe there's some other giant to take on this giant. Maybe here he is. Verse 12. Now David, he was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah. Oh, maybe it's not David. That was a small town. Nobody comes from that small town that is significant. Strike one. Whose name was Jesse, and he had 8 sons, and Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. Verse 13, the 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul to battle. Verse 14, David was the youngest. Oh no, strike 2. David is not even old enough to go into the battle. He is younger than 20. The 3 older ones followed Saul, King Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem. Oh no, he was a shepherd, not a warrior. Strike 3. Verse 17, then Jesse said to David his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves. Oh no. 3 strikes and you are out, even 4 and there is no more. David is a simple go-for. Nothing consequential to this boy. Verse 20. So David arose early in the morning. Okay. Can't believe it. He's not just a simple gopher. He's also a yes-man gopher. Who is this boy? He doesn't have anything to offer. Verse 23 picks up after David arrives. As David was talking with them, behold, the champion, the man between, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines. And he spoke the same words, and David heard them. And when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were, say, greatly afraid. Say that. Greatly afraid. Okay? Verse 32. I'm going to jump to verse 32. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will fight the Philistine. And then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, and now jump to verse 36, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. Verse 38, then Saul clothed David with his garments and put on a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with his armor. David girded his sword, that is, King Saul's sword, over his armor and tried to walk. He tried. Okay. Then David took them off. Verse 40. Here's what he took. He took his stick or his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag with which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand. These are all the resources of a lowly shepherd, not a mighty warrior. And he approached the Philistine. Verse 41. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. Verse 42. When the Philistines looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. And then the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Irony that God will turn Goliath's curse into a blessing in just a minute. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted this day. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. Look at the end of verse 46. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, verse 47, and that this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord, and he will give it into our hands. Verse 49, David pulled his hand into the bag and took from a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. Now you have to ask, there was a shield bearer in front of Goliath. He had like one job to do, right? When you're just given one job, and all he had to do was defend against one little stone, I'm sure the shield bearer got fired the next day. But, You know the rest of the story. David 1, verse 50. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no, this is an interesting, significant detail. There was no sword in David's hand. He eventually takes the sword of Goliath and chops off his head. Okay, so here's what we're learning this morning. The story of David and Goliath provides 3 steps to gain biblical courage and overcome fear. Here is the first one. Understand our problem with worldly courage. This narrative draws our attention to 2 different types of courage. You have the giant who is arrogant, taunting, and confident of his success against God's people. And then you have David who has none of the arrogant trappings, but is still confident of his success against Goliath. I think the author here is inviting us to look at that contrast. But let me mention something else. There's actually 2 Goliaths in this text. One is obvious, Goliath. Okay? The other one is not so obvious. There's another giant in this text. Does anybody know who it is? Anybody want to guess? Say, Brent, this is not, guess what Brent is thinking right now? King Saul. You say, what? I don't know if you remember, but King Saul was chosen for his height and appearance. In 1 Samuel 9:2, Saul was chosen as king based upon his appearance. Here's what it says. He is described as, from his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people of Israel. So King Saul was to be, based upon his appearance, Israel's champion. So much of a champion, huh? So we have one giant, Goliath, who is cocky and courageous, and you have one giant, not as giant as Goliath, but you have one tall man, Saul, who is fearful and trembling. And then you have this inconsequential David. What's the difference between all these men? I think the text is clear. 2 of them are defining courage in a certain way, and one is clearly different than the other 2. From where is Goliath getting his courage? Well, obviously from his stature, from his armor, from his weapons, and from his shield bearer who had one job to do, and he didn't do it. Really, what can touch Goliath? And let's call what Goliath has a worldly courage, a false confidence produced by trusting in the powers of this earth. You may say, Brent, what are the powers of this earth? Well, those resources considered mighty among men. And then it was the armor, it was the iron, it was the bronze, and Israel only had 2 swords, 1 set of armor. I'm not sure about that detail. They didn't have much armor. For Goliath, the author of 1 Samuel takes the unusual time to devote 3 whole verses to describe his stature and armaments. There is nothing like this else in Scripture, this kind of description of armaments. So it is significant. If you want to see the biggest man on campus with the greatest weapons, look no further than this man. By all definitions of a man, this one is the greatest. But just in the previous chapter, we heard Samuel saying, don't look at outward appearance. And for the other giants, Saul, when Saul wants to send someone else to fight this big man on campus, the tall man Saul doesn't fight, but he tries to equip somebody else with his powers of this earth. Tit for tat, Saul believes that the best way to try to match the mightiness of Goliath is to provide David with his mighty armor and one of the 2 swords in Israel. 1 Samuel 17, then Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor. And David girded King Saul's sword over his armor, and he tried to walk. With that false courage, or with that false confidence, Goliath's trust in the mightiness of his earthly strength produced in him this, a false confidence. I mean, you can just hear his arrogance mocking words. Again, the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we can fight together. And in verse 43, the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Who do you think I am? Look at me. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. I mean, we know the end of the story. We know what's going to happen. Goliath's seeming courage will mean nothing very soon. It is misplaced and causes him to be like this. Now let's stop for just a moment here. Do you know people, or are you one, who seems to be courageous, but it is a worldly courage? Meaning that maybe your confidence in an economic crisis, but you have wealth, so it doesn't matter to you. Maybe they or you are seemingly courageous in decisions and bold in your speech, but hey, you have all the influence and popularity among people anyway, so they're going to follow you no matter what. Or maybe they or you are wildly bold about winning a game because you have all the athletic ability. Maybe you or they are condescendingly confident because you have an IQ off the charts. Maybe they are callously and murderously harsh with a suspect. I'm thinking of a policeman, But they may be part of the protective good old boys, and they think nothing will ever happen to me. Or maybe, on the other hand, they are rioting, but they seem to have the current political winds at their back. Please remember that worldly courage can only take you so far in this world. Goliath certainly rose to be the champion for the Philistines because he had this kind of might and courage. He was the king of his little kingdom, so to speak. And also, King Saul certainly rose to be the king because he was a tally hottie of men among the Israelites. Worldly courage only gets you so far until somebody comes along with more might than you have. And that's the moment that intersects with our Overcoming Fear and Anxiety series here. When that happens, the worldly courage turns into a worldly cowardice. Fear and trembling when the powers of this earth, or the might of this earth, are seemingly not in one's possession. That's Saul and Israel. Because King Saul's trust was in the might of his tallness and his armor and the two swords that he had in Israel, well, the moment that somebody else came with more than two swords or more might or more height, he and the Israel were greatly dismayed and fearful. In our story of Joshua last week, God has demonstrated over and over that the victory is his. And he gave the children of Israel this command. When you go out to battle against your enemies and you see the might, the horses and the chariots and the people more numerous than you, or you could add taller than you, don't be afraid of them, for the Lord God is who brought you from the land of Egypt. You didn't have any armaments there. You were slaves. But he is with you. And that was one of the points last week, the presence of God. When you are approaching the battle, the priest will come out, speak to the people, and say, "Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted." We hear in David and Goliath, the Israelites were faint-hearted, greatly dismayed. Do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against the enemies, to save you. And all that matters is what we studied last week in regard to the power of God's presence. Have I not commanded you, Joshua, be strong and courageous? Do not tremble or be dismayed, because God is with you. Hope you're ready for some application questions now. Here's a question for you. Is my fear, okay, so I know all of us have been through a lot in the last 4 months. Some of us don't struggle with as much fear as others. Is my fear that I experience a result of me lacking some kind of earthly resource? Okay. Is my fear today a result of me comparing myself to another and saying, I'm not as good or as equipped as them? Or, let me look at it another way. If I'm not wrestling with fear right now, and is it possible that I am so comfortably well-resourced with friends or wealth or a job or power or influence that, hey, it doesn't matter, bring on the next pandemic. I am good in my fortress and my wealth. Ask yourself this: if I only had blank, then my soul would be quiet and not fearful. What is that blank? If it is something other than God, it probably reveals that you are probably trusting in the mights or the resources of this world and not God. That's what I have to ask myself on a regular basis. So let's recap. If we are going to understand how to overcome fear, we need to understand that, number one, worldly courage is a false confidence coming from trusting in the might or the powers or the strength of this earth. And when you lack these resources, the result will be worldly cowardice, fear, and trembling. And let's continue to step number two. If we are going to overcome fear and worry, we really need to see an attractive picture of what is biblical courage. That's what we need to see and behold. Here on the screen are excerpts from David's words. We know that the scripture says the mouth speaks out of that which fills the hearts. There is no instability about David's heart. There is no shaking. There is no trembling. Just hear these words afresh again. He's not concerned about himself. He's trying to comfort the Israelite army, trained warriors. Let no man's heart fail on account of him, Goliath, your servants. Notice how he calls himself a servant, not a warrior. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. This is his shepherding, inconsequential experiences. But the Lord is with him then. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. This day the Lord will deliver you, Goliath, into my hands. And notice his purpose. So that all that this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear. For the battle is the Lord, and he will give you into our hands. David was able to see past any limited earthly resources. They didn't even come up in his speech. David did not number the swords of Israel. Hey, we have 2. It doesn't matter. David did not size himself up and says, well, I'm only 5'6", and he's like over 9 feet tall. It doesn't matter. Because David was not trusting or relying on the distracting powers of this earth. There's a lot of humor in this story, and I'm as you continue to study the Bible more, you realize that God has a beautiful sense of humor. And in verse, I think the author is meaning for us to get a little chuckle out of verses 38 and 39. I mean, can you imagine over 6 foot tall Saul with his armor? And he tries to put it under, I don't know exactly David's height, but probably under 6 foot tall. And so the Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on him. And I'm sure David could even see out of the helmet. David girded his sword over his armor, and he tried to walk. The humor. I know some of you know that I like Star Wars, and when I have that stormtrooper outfit. Some of you may not even know what I mean by that, but it looks like white armor. And it looks so intimidating, and I love being in it, except when I tried to walk. So you can't do anything in that suit. And ultimately, Goliath couldn't do much either. He was there for intimidation purposes, and a stone felled him. This was going to hurt David. King Saul thinks that his 6 foot armor size with his big sword is going to help some 5 foot-ish boy. Ultimately, King Saul's foolish trust in his mighty things of this earth would have put David in danger. David couldn't even walk with that stuff. The resources, the might, the strengths of this earth become for us distracting objects that will put us in danger. In fact, one of the great ironies of this story is that what Goliath trusted in, his armor and his huge sword, becomes the object which he is beheaded by. I didn't read that verse for you, but you can read it as you continue to study the story. Our trust in the earth's might, the strengths of this earth, take us away from God. God who made the mighty resources, God who made the iron for the sword, God who made the metalsmith, who crafted the iron for the sword, God who made the people who make these things. We tend to fear the intimidating people whom the living God made. Why don't we fear God? The things of this earth we fear become those things which bring about our demise as we trust in them and not God. But our fear of God brings about our salvation. David was unexpectedly unconcerned about earthly power, strengths, riches, royalty, weaponry, because he feared the living God. The attractiveness of biblical courage, it has a simple trust in the living God alone. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? And verse 36, since he has taunted the armies of, say it, the living God. And because his trust was in the living God, he picked up sticks, stones, and approached the Philistine and took courageous action. David's actions are fairly amazing. Fearing God and not this giant who has more resources, earthly speaking, than David did. Imagine living like David every day. We would face risks and reach out in love on behalf of others without fear. Think about our first testimony, Anna Walters, when you saw that in our summer series. And, it was encouraging to me. I was trying to set up the testimonies, and Anna trying to scramble to get somebody to go first. And our series was called Overcoming Fear and Worry. And she said, Brent, this COVID thing is kind of energizing to me. I really get to use my skills here. She said, Brent, I really don't worry a lot when I go into the hospital. Well, Anna, then I can't use you for my testimony. Can you just say you worry a little bit? We crafted her testimony, and it came out fine. But Anna was not somebody who feared and worried. We would serve and give our mighty resources to others without thinking of what it's going to cost us. We could face the most difficult circumstances, security-threatening earthly circumstances like death. I'm thinking of Becky and David Arthur with their testimonies last week. And we could face those without panic, with a calm assurance. We would not fear the next pandemic, the riots, or the wars, or the economic collapse, or the diagnosis, because we would see it all as an opportunity to make the name of the living God known. Through many dangers, toils, and fears we have all been through in the last 4 months, we are by no means done, it would seem, yet. And let me say a word about our senior pastor for a moment. By God's grace, I have watched Pastor Vyers get up every morning and simply choose to do the next righteous thing in leading our church family. That's been a very refreshing thing. Without panic, without fear, here's what the Lord has given us today. And we need to righteously face the problem, acknowledge that Goliath is there, and do what we can do. And not just him, but you. The testimonies that we have seen and are all evidences of you demonstrating this kind of stable biblical courage during perilous times. Thank you for being a courageous church family. And let's move to the third and final step today. Well, let me ask you, What did the Israelites need to see the most? Okay, that's an important question. What did the Israelites, the fearful and trembling Israelites, need to see the most? Was it one mighty giant, Saul, taking on another mighty giant, Goliath? An epic clash of the titans, so to speak. Superman versus Batman. Avengers versus Thanos. A force-wielding Skywalker versus another force-wielding Skywalker or Palpatine. I have to get Star Wars in here multiple times. You guys know that, right? Please notice what Tolkien did not create. He did not create a story of Sauron versus Gandalf, if you know the story. He created the hobbits versus Sauron. What did Israel need to see the most? What if the living God could use what the world would consider foolish, inconsequential, insignificant to win the victory, to show that the battle is the Lord's? It doesn't matter what earthly resources you have. So, after we understand the problem with worldly courage and after we see what biblical courage is all about, how do we get there? Number 3, adopt the champion through whom God's victory is won. As I mentioned in the beginning, perhaps we do not need to see ourselves as David so much as we need to see ourselves as the Israelites. What did they need to see in order to be shocked out of their trust in the strengths of this earth? They needed to see God using one who is lowly and not powerful by the standards of men. And that's the point. David was the unexpected champion, the unexpected man between. The best way for you and I to see that our earthly resources in which we trust do not provide courage is to see how God used those without the trappings of might and strength, showing that the battle is the Lord's. And this becomes a theme of all of Scripture. The lowly would be exalted. The last shall be first. The least would be the greatest. Out of the smallest town, Bethlehem would become the mighty Messiah, the greatest deliverer, and one who would remove the reproach of his people. Goliath taunted the armies of Israel for 40 days. Sounds like a biblical time frame for tempting and testing. God's people lived in shame and reproach during the testing time that their humiliating fear brought on them. David's concern was not for his own glory, but the reproach that his own people's sinful fear had brought upon them. In 1 Samuel 17, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach of God's people? The term reproach in Hebrew refers to shame and disgrace. David stepped forward to remove that from all of the armies of Israel. Lowly shepherd, not a warrior. And by the way, did you notice what happened to the only one who unashamedly stepped forward to battle Goliath? What did he receive? He received shame and disgrace. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He started mocking him and his God. He took the shame and the disgrace in the valley of the shadow of death. The Israelites needed someone to bear their shame and their disgrace. And God's people also needed one who would be the man between, the champion, winning the Lord's battle. The Philistines had their champion, but did you notice how none of the Israelites pronounced David as theirs? Oh, he's too young. He's from Bethlehem. He's not even in the army. He's a shepherd. He's a gopher. He's a yes man. Nobody said, well, here in the red corner is David, shepherd by day and warrior by night. He's going to be our champion, and David is our man. Nobody said that. Nobody proclaims David a worldly champion at all. The title of champion is given to Goliath. There is only one title given to David. Let no man, and it's in his own mouth. Your servant will go and fight. How was the victory for God's people won? Not by a man between or a champion championing his power, his status, his riches, his weaponry, but a servant willing to trust the living God. My friends, it's not hard to see Jesus here, is it, my friends? This is the point. This is a point of the story. The unexpected servant. So now focus your mind, not in this text, but the trajectory of where this text leads us to Jesus. Not born in a sprawling capital city known for its fortresses and its dynasties, but in a no-name town from a no-name family. Not born in a palace, but a manger. Not wrapped in royal robes, but in rags. Not eye candy for the masses, but an unexpected servant who came to serve. The one who would bear our shame and our disgrace. The one who turned the curse of death into a victory of life for us on the cross, and thereby defeated the one wielding the mighty powers of this earth, the scaly serpent Satan, and the one whom no one would have chosen as our champion. In fact, they all disdained him. But he has been declared the Son of God, the man between, and now sits at the right hand of God as our intercessor. Folks, the ultimate Goliaths we face are not the pandemics, the riots, the cancer diagnosis on this earth. Goliath does not simply represent your trials, but also your greatest trial, sin that separates you from God. And you cannot win that battle without a champion, a man between. You may not recognize him by his outward appearance, but you recognize him by his servant spirit, his humility, not the trappings of earthly strength. That man is Jesus Christ, and that battle is his to save you from your sin. If you do not know him this morning, that is the only man between in whom you trust in order to win the battle over sin for you. If you do not know him, your pastors this week would have no greater joy than to talk to you about him. Now, believers, the only way that you will continue to face this world's challenges with biblical courage is only if you are not relying on the world's mighty resources, which will come and go, and you will be at their mercies at the next pandemic or the next riot that take some of those resources from you. Christ demonstrated that it is not by might that he won the greatest battle, but through trusting in the living God. So, how do we overcome fear and worry? We are not in a battle of superheroes, relying on superpowers. First, understand the problem with worldly courage. See the beauty of biblical courage and adopt the solution, the right champion, the man between. And then we can be courageous. Let's pray. Our Father, thank you for giving us just the beautiful stories in your word. Those that have gone before us, fought the battles before us, so that we might see what you're doing in the lives of your people and drawing people to yourself. We ask for your help for us to contemplate this and to implement in our lives more.